And now, Ms. Harris, let's see if we can have you to talk about the topic, that is slavery and the African American heritage, by informing our audience through your books in reference to some of this information.
Okay. The first book that I've written and I would like to talk about is entitled Gloucester. And it's named after a small town in Mississippi. And my grandmother, when I was growing up, told my cousins as well as my brother about what had transpired in Gloucester. In Gloucester, where my grandmother lived, with her father and mother and her 7 sisters and brothers, uh, there was a horrific crime that took place in that area. And and it's about my great grandfather, who was born as Willis Felix Faust in 1859. His mother was Margaret Longmire. And doing my research, I had heard about them. I had no idea where I could find them. So July of 2014, I found my great-great-grandmother, who was my great-grandfather's mother. She was living at the time in Woodville, Mississippi. She was born in 1830 as a slave. I found her living with her, I'm assumed, slave master, a former slave master, and her daughter, and her the other people that were living in the house with them, who my great grandfather was a servant to. His name was Dr. Samuel Haynes. The owner of the plantation was William Haynes, and at that time, it wasn't a plantation, but the slaves. He owned about 100 slaves were still on his property.
Sharecroppers and similar kinds of activities,
Yes.
doing essentially what they had done during the period of slavery, but now under freedom. And most of the attitudes and all of those things were still connected with the institution of slavery. I'm very, very familiar with that because I think that that, in a real sense, is the heritage of a large number of us who've looked back into whatever. But go on and tell your story.
Right, and that's true. They never had the means to move off of the property, so they remained there, like you said, and worked for them as probably former slaves. And so I found him with his mom and sister when he was 11 years old in 1870. And his father, I believe, was the owner of a slave trading company because his last name was Faust. And I found, during my research, I found a Faust and Wilson slave trading company. And I want the audience to keep the Wilson in mind because I'm going to refer to that in a few minutes. But what happened was that according to our oral history, Willis Faust was a foster child. And I found that difficult to believe because I couldn't see a black male child being a foster child. So I found his mother, who was 40 at the time, and a sister who was 17. She was a Haynes, the mother was a Longmire, and Willis was a Faust. So we got 3 different names, and they were living in the Haynes house. I believe that Martha, who was Willis's mother, had her daughter by William Haynes, who was the headmaster in the house, because all 4 of them were living in the house with him. In addition to that, the sister had had a baby who was named Anthony Haynes, and the baby was about 2 months old. So they were all living on the farm with the as a family. According to our family history, Dr. Haynes taught Willis how to read and write. And he had the equivalent to an eighth grade education, which he was which would be highly educated for a black man at that time. Right. What happened is that this became problematic down through his life because in 1909, he had previously acquired 38.1 acres of land under the Homestead Act. And he and his wife, Delia, her name was Delia Wilson, her slave owners were also slave traders. And they had the 7 children. And with the 7 children, they were able to acquire this land and they farmed on the land. Well, in 1909, Willis went to a store to acquire supplies for his farm. And there are several versions of how Willis ended up in the situation he ended up, but I would tell the story I believe to definitely that can be documented. He went to, as I said, get the supplies. When he got there, the young lady, he gave the young lady monies for his supplies. And evidently he had an account there. And when he gave the lady his money, instead of subtracting the money, she added the money. And he confronted her about it. And so she said, "Are you calling me a liar?" And he said, "No, I'm not calling you a liar, but numbers don't lie." So that evening when he went home, there was a mob that came to his house, told him to come outside or they would burn him and his family in the house. So he decided to come outside, and they got him and lynched him at that particular time. And so my grandmother and the rest of the family had to acquire whatever belongings they could and leave immediately. And they went to live with her, with Delia, who was Willis's wife's people, until they were able to migrate north.
Well, and of course, I think we're getting ready for our second commercial break here, Ms. Harris. But that's essentially the kind of information that we're looking for, and I think that sort of brings into focus not only what happened with your family, but what happened to a large number of families, and
Of course.
lynchings and violence and burnings and et cetera and et cetera.
Okay.
So we're going to get back. We'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Miss Vivian Harris, and she's given us some information in reference to the African American experience and African American heritage and slavery. And Ms. Harris, let's see if we can pick up where we left off and give you an opportunity to talk about the legacy, the book dealing with the legacy in reference to all of this. And we've got, as I said earlier, 10 minutes, and start wherever you wish and give the information that you wish to give within that 10-minute framework so that it might enlighten our audience in reference to some of the things that you wish to enlighten them about this morning.
Okay. The second book that I have, I'm just about finished with, is entitled Legacy, and the legacy of the Jordan Green, Faust, Smith families. And I'm going to talk about the Jordan part, the Jordan Green part. These were my father's people. My great-grandfather was named Columbus Jordan Green. He was born in Waycross, Georgia in 1840. Interestingly, his mother was Native American and his father was Irish. And his father had he and his brother in the house with him and his stepmother, and reared him until he was an adult, and he did not know that his mother was a slave on his father's plantation. His father sold his mother, and when he sold his mother, he found out that he found this information out and decided that he and his brother wanted no parts of their father who had participated in slavery. So he and his brother left, and they went. The next place that I found him was in Vernell Station, Georgia. And around 1810, his wife was, who was my great grandmother. His second wife was, her mother was born around 1810, and her name was Anne Galloway, and she married an African, and so they were born in Virginia, and probably around 1850, Jordan bought Anne and her husband, and so they were moved to Waycross, Georgia, and there my great grandmother was born. So interestingly, if you can get this picture, my great grandfather married his father's slave, one of his father's slaves, who was Nancy Galloway. And the two of them I found 16 children. But before then, Columbus was married to a Caucasian woman. And I found 2 documented children, and I know that 4 other children existed. And so Columbus had 18 children. And around 1893, Columbus had moved his family to Friars Point, Mississippi. And he had, the family had 2 sets of twins, and they were living in Friars Point. At the time, Columbus seemed to have had plenty of money because he had a cook named Margaret Snow living with them. At some point, with having that many children, his money ran out, and he became a sharecropper. So he had to migrate from Yazoo City, Mississippi, to Forest City, Arkansas.
No, he didn't.
Yes, he did. And so and that's where he died. He died in Forest City, Arkansas.
That's where my wife is from, Forest City, Arkansas.
Really?
I know quite a bit about Forest City, Arkansas.
Oh, okay. Okay, then. So they had, so what happened was that the family, the younger children, moved with him to Forest City. And the older children, I thought that some of them were dead. I found out about a week or 2 ago that my grandfather's twin sister and his oldest sister lived side by side. And so now I've got to add this information to the book. But they lived a frugal life, but he made sure that the family stayed together and that they were educated and that they stood up for their rights, because he was definitely into people standing up for their rights.
And so most of your relatives at that time were from Forest City, Arkansas. They were from Forest City, Arkansas, in the area Brinkley and Helena and
Right.
all of those
Haynes,
Arkansas, and all
right.
of those areas down there.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, my wife is from that general area there.
Interesting.
We attended, both of us attended A&M College in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. And so
Okay.
that's the connection we have with Arkansas. And I thought at one time you were about to say something about either Tennessee or Alabama and et cetera, because that was part of the migratory movement
Right.
that black people were making out of the South, coming from the deep South, going out west and Arkansas and Memphis and going on Tennessee and going on across, heading northward or westward as far as they could possibly. And I would imagine your family got caught up in that kind of movement as well.
They did. According to a lady that I interviewed that lived in the area, Mrs. Clementine Davis, the land became very difficult to farm, so a lot of people moved out of the area. And the migratory route that my grandparents took was through Missouri. And my grandmother had my aunt in Missouri. And then they crossed the Mississippi River into southern Illinois. And that is where my grandmother and my grandfather reared their children, which one of them, the oldest child, living child was my father. And so they, and the rest of them moved to Cleveland, Detroit, and Toledo, and Canton, Ohio, and even into New York. So they definitely moved to those areas. So
Are you familiar with the book Other Sons?
I've never read
Isabel, dealing with the migration of African Americans out of the South and to North and to California and all of those areas that you're talking about. You should read that. That has a lot of information dealing with exactly what you were talking about, dealing with the migratory movement, moving from Forest City to Helena and on off looking toward Texas and Arkansas, and even passing our little town there, Hope, Arkansas, at one time, because that's that was our movement going toward Texas and et cetera. And so that's the legacy, I think. That's what you're talking about, the legacy of movement and the coming together of the races in a real sense after the institution of slavery was over, and in a real sense. Very good. Okay, we've got about a minute and 25 seconds here, Ms. Harris, but give us some final statements that you'd like to.
I want to say that because I have really enjoyed researching my family history, I encourage people to document their family history, because history is really, really interesting. And I run into a lot of people who say that they're going to do it. I think that anything that you can write down is so important, because someone may be like Alex Haley and research it, and the more information you have, the easier it is to research, so. But I wanted to tell you I am most appreciative for you having me on your show and letting me share my family history with you.
Very good. Let me tell you how much we appreciate you sharing that information with us, because it only reminds me of who we are. You see what you say, we are all over everywhere.
That's true.
And I want to thank you for coming by and giving us that excellent information. And let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.